Welcome to the Digital Campus Podcast with eCampusOntario, the show for educators and learners who are participating in and shaping the future of higher education in the digital era. Each episode features insightful conversations with leaders in education and other experts to bring you valuable perspective and strategies for navigating digital pedagogy in higher education today and tomorrow. The Digital Campus Podcast is where innovation meets higher ed.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Digital Campus Podcast with eCampusOntario. I'm your host, Robert Luke. Canadians are hearing a lot about international students these days. And in today's episode, we're looking at how innovative digital solutions can provide more support to international students. We will look at how a digitally guided support system can be used throughout the academic life cycle, from pre-admission and education to post-graduation. All of this can help lead international graduates to promising careers in Ontario and participating in our growing economy. Here with me today to talk about this is Dr. Alexander Hughes, who's currently a Research and Foresight Associate here at eCampusOntario, and who has recently completed some important research into the international learner journey in the Ontario post-secondary education system. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Alex, to get it started, talk a little bit more about the research that you did and tell us, why are the issues of international students so topical today here in Canada? And why do people want to study in Canada?
So back in spring of 2023, we started to see a lot more news out about international learners, and international learners were constantly something that kept coming up in other research we were working on at eCampusOntario. And we decided it was time to really dive in and investigate that journey that international learners take through post-secondary education in Ontario. In fact, we mapped out this journey that, nobody had really looked at it before, from the application stage and researching post-secondary institutions, all the way through the postgraduate work permits and possible lives in Canada. And we've seen a lot of negative news coming out about the struggles to find housing, financial pressures, visa and immigration pressures that these students are facing. They have really become one of the top news items in the country. To go to the other part of the question about why do people want to study in Canada? Well, Canada offers one of the top post-secondary education institutions anywhere globally. And it is also a lot more affordable in contrast to places like the United States. Some of the pathways that are available for learners postgraduate, including the postgraduate work permit, also draw many learners to study in Canada.
Well, that's pretty interesting. And I like in the report how you have mapped out specifically what that international learner journey looks like, and also the complex web of actors, as you say in the report, that can lead to information overload. And it's interesting that you say that nobody has really paid attention to that before, what that journey, the journey looks like. The journey is not just leaving the country and coming to Canada. The journey starts quite before that. What are the challenges that international students face in the application stage? And then I want to ask you a little bit about what the challenges they face in adapting to academic life in Canada.
Yeah, you're right, Robert. Scholars and researchers have looked at different aspects of the international learner journey, such as, supports when they first arrive, or English language or French language supports. But nobody has really looked at the journey as a holistic, all-inclusive experience. So that was one of the things we mapped out in our report. And we found this complex web of actors that appear throughout an international learner's journey. And these are all the people that an international learner may interact with at different stages of their journey. When they're researching post-secondary education, this could be anybody from an educational agent, family and friends, their local schools and post-secondary education institution, financiers, their local country's government, Ontario PSE websites, Ontario PSE representatives, as well as Government of Canada and provincial website. On top of that, they also turn to a lot of non or unlegitimate sources of information, Reddit, Facebook, forums. There's now TikTok and Instagram and YouTube influencers that talk about this journey as well. And what we basically determined was at this stage in an international learner's journey, there's a significant information barrier. And students are confused by government and institutional websites because often this is written in complex language that can be difficult to understand. So they turn to these informal and uninformed channels to find answers, not necessarily always the right answer.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. And we've all faced information overload when we, search for something on the internet. And I can only imagine what it would be like to do something as complex as plot out your international education travel, not the least of which is, how are you going to find the program? And it strikes me that there's a really significant opportunity here to provide clarity in what we are looking for in terms of Ontario's post-secondary education. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges students face then in adapting to academic life in Canada. And what did you find out in that area?
When it comes to adapting to post-secondary life in Canada, one of the biggest barriers is that students don't feel prepared for the learning style in Ontario specifically. And this has multiple segments coming off of it. So the first would be like the style of teaching in Ontario is very different than the way things are in other countries. This could be anything from, actually asking questions of your professor, debate in class, or even approaching a professor or TA for something like an extension on an assignment. Other things like online and hybrid modality. We know with the COVID-19 pandemic, first in 2020, that much of the post-secondary sector had an emergency shift to online and hybrid modalities. And many learners were unprepared for this. But international learners have also expressed that they just aren't sure of how to interact in an online or hybrid classroom. This could be something as simple as using a learning management system. They're unprepared for classroom expectations. So what makes an A paper? And, that's something we also hear from domestic students as well. How much reading is required? Do I really need to buy the textbook? Communications. This is something as simple as, sending an email to your professor, reaching out to fellow students for support or to do a group project. Other things like where to find academic support. They don't know to turn to teaching and learning centers or to libraries for academic support, as well as digital fluency, which is the set of skills required to succeed in a online or hybrid classroom and eventually a digital labor force.
That's a really important point. The future of learning is the future of work, and that future is right now. We are doing this podcast interview virtually, and a lot of work is happening and will happen this way. So this idea of digital fluency strikes me as very important, certainly important to eCampus Ontario. Is it your sense that international learners possess the digital fluency required to succeed? Are there other challenges in terms of the academic expectations? You've already talked a little bit about learning styles and certainly language barriers, but what are some of the other ways in which these challenges are coming to bear in the learners that you spoke with?
Under the third round of the virtual learning strategy, eCampus Ontario, and I was involved on this project, we developed a micro-credential to support learner acquisition of digital fluency skills. Now, this course wasn't necessarily designed for international students, rather for any student entering into an online or hybrid classroom. We thought that a course like this could be a great prerequisite to work on these skills as they enter the classroom. But in my research with international learners, I actually proposed this digital fluency micro-credential, the Digital Fluency Accelerator, which is available as an OER on eCampus Ontario's Open Library, to many of the international learners, just as is this something that you think would have helped early on in your studies? And overwhelmingly, all of our interview participants would have been interested in the acquisition of some of these skills prior to starting in an Ontario post-secondary classroom. And digital fluency is kind of the middle set of skills on a spectrum of digital skills, starting with digital literacy. Then it goes into digital fluency and ends with digital mastery. And at the digital fluency stage, it's really about, how to use most basic digital skills, but it's upgrading those skills to the next level. It's the ability to conduct a podcast, make a video, manipulate images, find and research data using databases, write proficient digital correspondence. co-working with other students in a digital environment, delivering a digital presentation or interview. And all these types of skills are essential to all students, but international students especially really wanted something like that prior to starting their studies.
Which makes a lot of sense. And these are highly motivated learners who are investing a considerable amount of energy, finances, and attention into making the journey to becoming a student here over in Ontario. So it makes sense that they're going to want to increase their digital fluency. I really liked how you talked about the three levels: digital fluency, digital literacy, and digital mastery. That strikes me as an excellent way, a graduated way, to talk about how we get people, all of us really, socialized into the idea of not just learning about technology, but learning with technology. Your research uncovered some really interesting and innovative proposed solutions. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about these opportunities that your research revealed for better or more digital support for international students.
When we were speaking with international students, three different areas kind of emerged out of digital solutions. And we looked at the different barriers that international learners face. And there's three scopes of barriers that we've faced. So the first being solvable. And those are the barriers that we understand and know how to solve. So this is something like the information barrier that we talked about a little bit earlier in this podcast. And some of the solutions we looked at under the solvable scope of barriers included a working group on international learners. This is basically a coalition of different actors in the post-secondary education sector here in Ontario. And it could be the institutions themselves, especially their presidents, organizations like eCampusOntario, Colleges Ontario, Council of Ontario Universities, and the Indigenous Institute Consortium. And coming together to look at the problems that international learners are facing and working together to basically build digital solutions to help these learners out. One of the solutions that, a coalition like this could work on would be something like blockchain acceptance letters. One of the major stories coming out in the news in 2023 was fraudulent admission letters that were used to fraudulently obtain immigration status in Canada.
It's a real problem.
Because these letters could quite literally be whipped together in Microsoft Word, there's nothing showing that a letter in itself is legitimate. So by storing a letter like this on the blockchain, it shows that it's been issued by a legitimate issuer, such as a post-secondary institution, and the receiver is also the legitimate receiver, that it isn't a duplicate or a copy of this letter. And this is something that could also solve some of the new regulations that IRCC brought forward in changes to the international student program, and could also support other federal partners like the CBSA as international learners actually enter Canada. The digital fluency micro-credential that we just spoke about is another great solvable solution to help that digital fluency skill. We've also looked at an all-encompassing website with validated information and an AI chatbot to support learners as they first set out to research post-secondary institutions in Ontario, and use an AI chatbot to ask any questions that they may have, rather than trying to reach out over email or phone across time zones and across the world. We've also looked at some other solutions like digital peer mentorship forums, a labor market connectivity study and stay program, such as based off the success of EduNova in Nova Scotia. Learners also recommended portals to help support housing, employment, and mental health, or even something like the mandatory licensing of education agents, or a portal to look up agents and transfer documents to them securely.
So it really sells to me that the learners that you spoke with are really seeking, as you put it, validated information that they can turn to as an official source, but also to find ways to ensure that they're talking to trusted actors in anywhere along the value chain.
Exactly. we've talked to learners about these education agents, and often, some had great relationships and said, my agent was trusted. They got plenty of my friends or family into institutions, so I knew they were a trustworthy individual. But others, were sold some rather false promises about coming to Ontario, being told northern institutions were near major cities, or that, you'll get a job, no problem, which isn't necessarily the reality of the situation in Ontario.
Right. Well, that idea of getting a job, I think, is important. And Canada has the need to include, to include as many people as possible, and to link the immigration system and the international student system into the labor market. So you mentioned, ways in which labor market connectivity could be enhanced through study and state programs like that, which Edunova runs. And it strikes me that the by removing some of the bad information out there and streamlining this in a way that helps everybody kind of collaborate to compete together is going to solve the information barrier for the international students themselves, but also help to proactively solve things like labor market challenges that we may be having in communities across the country.
Yeah, exactly. I think if students in their upper years or final years of study receive some sort of mentorship, and it's mentorship on things that all students really could require, resume writing, interviewing skills, but how do they actually translate their skills into employment? And what industries are looking for that kind of thinker or individuals with that skill to ensure that learners translate their academically learned skills into meaningful labor and as economic power in Ontario.
And in so doing, become part of the social and the cultural fabric of Ontario and Canada as well. And I think those are great ways that we can be thinking of to support international graduates to transition into employment. Because really, I think we can all agree that full participation in Ontario's growing economy is absolutely essential. In the report, you talk about the scope of barriers quite nicely, and you look at those as solvable, and then you look at those as difficult, and then you look at those wicked problems, those that are complex to even define, much less address: housing, employment, and immigration. Now, properly speaking, you might say that those are not the purview of the post-secondary education sector, although with all of the rhetoric and discussion happening now, schools are being asked to come up with a plan for housing of students. In your proposed solutions, you talk about housing, of course, but employment and mental health. And we've had a good discussion about employment. Let's talk a little bit about mental health and what it means to move to a new country and integrate into the labor market. Did your learners have anything to say about the challenges and the opportunities they face in that area?
Yeah, so learners definitely express that they feel lonely in Canada, and they also feel disconnected from both domestic and other international students. And that the experience, of traveling across the world, trying to establish a life is really difficult. It's something that, I can only imagine the hardships that a lot of these individuals go through. And several of our interviewees expressed that this was rather detrimental to their mental health, and they were unsure of where to turn to, how to navigate the Ontario health system without access to something like OHIP, and how do they access mental health supports. And we've seen several institutions establish their own mental health services and provide learners with access to mental health professionals. But if this could be undertaken by a coalition of Ontario's colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes to establish a portal that grants any Ontario post-secondary student access to the resources to support their mental health and support this transition and support these feelings of loneliness and isolation that many of these international learners feel, I think this could also be helpful to many domestic students as well who are moving away from home for the first time.
That's an excellent point. And certainly the transformative power of education is it does help to socialize one into the larger culture and society. And I would agree that we should be doing everything we can to smooth that transition for all learners. That's nicely put. This has been a fantastic discussion. And is there anything about the report that you want to add before we close?
I encourage as many people as possible to read it. If our sector can work together to maybe establish some of these solutions for international learners to support their journey, it may be very beneficial. I think a lot of these solutions, while they were created specifically for international learners, could also support domestic learners and their course through post-secondary as well.
Yeah, excellent point, Alex. Well, 2 points, really, I think. One is supporting international learners, and all learners are a great way to combine forces, and the idea of working together is absolutely essential. I wonder then if we could just end where it all started. You talked a little bit about the history of the study permit system, and I don't see anybody talking about this in any of the news reports that I've read, that we all just accept that this is part of it. But you uncovered some pretty interesting facts about the origin of this. Can you unpack that for us, please?
Thanks, Robert. As a historian, I'm always happy to dive into the history of how we got somewhere. And I dove into some of the great works by Paul Axelrod and A.B. Mikulop, great historians out of Ontario, just to kind of trace the history of international students. The first international students were actually Americans and Brits coming to study in about the 1840s. But the system rapidly changed following the Second World War. And between 1945 and 1960, when, Ontario's college system was created and many universities opened, there was a boom in the amount of institutions in Ontario. And this started to attract more and more international learners, many of whom were coming to Canada and specifically Ontario to obtain education that wasn't available in their home countries. And it was in 1962, in both the context of the Vietnam War and the Cold War, that Canada created the student visa. And the student visa classification was created as a non-immigrant classification where, you could basically come to Canada, study, but then you had to rapidly leave. And the thought process behind this was that there was fear of radical ideas, particularly from American students and anti-war activists and draft dodgers that were potentially entering Canada to avoid things going on in the United States. When we're talking about student visas today, they're really coming out of a system that was developed in 1962. It's rather archaic in 2024 to still be using this student permit that was created in a completely different social, political, and economic and cultural environment.
You certainly make a good point that it's, in some respects, is a bit anachronistic, and maybe some of the challenges that we've seen is because we don't have a forward-facing 21st century policy. We've got a protectionist end of 20th century policy in effect that has been adapted or pressed into the use of the present. This is what it sounds like.
Exactly. It's slowly modified throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where it became different actors were interested in bringing international learners into Canada. And, something like the differential fee policy between domestic learners and international learners came in the 70s as a response to what happened in 1962. In the 80s and 90s, institutions themselves really were recruiting international learners to supplement income. And in the 2000s, it shifted to active government recruitment to bring international learners over. And then we're at today.
What an amazing conversation, Alex. Thank you so much. And I see the value of a historian like yourself coming in and helping us understand from where we have come to where we are today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I'd just like everybody who listens to take a look at the report. Read it for yourselves and really look into the solutions that we present.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate you making the time today. And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Digital Campus Podcast with eCampusOntario. Thanks to Alexander Hughes for joining me today to share his recent research finding on the important and topical issue of international students in Ontario higher education. We'll include links to the research report and other news and resources mentioned on the show. Thank you for listening. I'm Robert Luke, and this is the Digital Campus Podcast.
Thank you for joining eCampus Ontario on the Digital Campus Podcast, the show for educators who are shaping the future of higher education in the digital era. If you like the show, please subscribe now and share a link to it with your connections. Visit our website and follow us on X and LinkedIn for more information, tools, and support to successfully navigate digital pedagogy in higher ed for today and tomorrow. Funded by the Government of Ontario and the Government of Canada. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the funders.